Greetings. My name is David Neilsen, and I'd like to present for you Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, an abridged version. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shores of the Hudson River lies a small market town, which by some is called Greenburg, but which is more generally and properly known as Tarrytown. The name was given in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country for the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Not far from this village, there is a little lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it with just murmur enough to lull one to repose. This sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. Some say it is bewitched. Well, certain it is, the place is under the sway of some power which holds a spell over the minds of the good people. They are given to all manner of marvelous beliefs, are subject to visions and trances, and frequently see strange sights, and hear music and voices in the air. The entire neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. The dominant spirit that haunts this enchanted region is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried off by a cannonball in some nameless battle of the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the good country folk hurrying along in the gloom of the night as if on the wings of the wind. This spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. In this by-place of nature, there abode a worthy wight by the name of Ichabod Crane, who instructed the children of the vicinity. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, and hands which dangled a mile out of their sleeves. His whole frame was most loosely hung together. His head was small, but with huge ears, great green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. His schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices might be heard on a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood, and he picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folk. Now, his appetite for the marvelous, as well as his powers of digesting it, were extraordinary, and both had been increased with his residence in this spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. One source of this fearful pleasure was to pass the long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, haunted fields, haunted brooks, haunted bridges, haunted houses, and particularly the Headless Horseman, or Galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. If there were any pleasure in all this, it were dearly purchased by the terrors of the subsequent walk homewards. Oh, what fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness. Yet daylight put an end to all these evils, and so he would have passed a pleasant life of it, had his path not been crossed by a being which causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together. And that being was a woman. Among the musical disciples who gathered one evening in each week to receive his instructions was Katrina Van Tassel, daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. Oh, she was a blooming lass, a fresh 18, plump as a partridge, and universally famed, not only for her beauty, but for her vast expectations. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the fairer sex. It is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favour in his eye, particularly after he visited her in her paternal mansion. Oh, old Baltus Van Tassel was the picture perfect of a thriving, contented farmer. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson River, and hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn, every crevice of which and window was bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. Ichabod's heart yearned for the damsel who would inherit all of this, and his only study was in how to gain her affections. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulty than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such like easily conquerable adversaries with which to contend. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, and he had to encounter a host of rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, each keeping a watchful and angry eye on each other, but ready to fly out in common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring blade by the name of Brom Van Brunt. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he received the nickname Brom Bones. He was famed for his great knowledge and skill in horsemanship. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but he had more mischief than ill will in his composition. This rantable hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries. And though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, so it was that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his advances were signals for rival candidates to depart who felt no inclination to cross a lion in its amours. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character as singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. And from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interest in Brom Bones evidently declined, and a deadly feud arose between the two. In this way, matters went on for some time. Then, on one fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in a pensive mood, sat enthroned upon the lofty stool from whence he watched over the concerns of his little literary realm. His scholars were all busily intent upon their books, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the courtroom, the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a man who clattered up the school door with an invitation for Ichabod to attend a merrymaking or quilting frolic to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. Scholars were hurried through their studies without stopping at trifles. Books were flung aside without being put back on shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent an extra half an hour brushing and furbishing up his best, his only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of looking-glass in the mirror, which hung up on the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciliated, and thus, gallantly mounted, he issued forth like a knight-errant on a quest of adventure. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plough horse that had outlived everything but its viciousness. Though he was gaunt and shagged, one eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, while the other had the gleam of the genuine devil in it. But he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees up nearly to the pommel of his saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like a grasshopper's, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. Now, it was toward evening Ichabod arrived at the castle of Herr von Tassel. Oh, a world of charms burst upon his enraptured eyes as he entered. Not those of the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious displays of red and white. No, with the luxurious display of the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Oh, Ichabod's spirits rose with eating the way some men's do with drink, and he could not help, too, but rolling his eyes all about him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this unimaginable luxury and splendor. And now, music from the common room summoned to the dance. Oh, Ichabod prided himself about his dancing. Not a limb, not a fibre was idle. His whole loosely hung frame was in full motion and clattering about the room. The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling gaily at all of his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, stood brooding in the corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folk who sat gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. But these were nothing compared to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. Oh, many dismal tales were told of funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree in the center of the village. The chief part of these stories, however, turned upon the favorite spectre of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman. The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from a foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him on his horse, and how they galloped over bush and a brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached a bridge which crossed a dark black stream not far from a church, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower from the horse, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This story was immediately followed by a thrice marvellous tale from Brom Bones. He affirmed that, returning one night from the neighbouring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by the galloping Hessian, and he'd offered to race him for a bowl of punch, and he would have won too, but just as they came to that church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, sank deep into the mind of Ichabod. The revel gradually came to an end. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the customs of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that by now he was on the high road to success. What passed at this interview, I will not pretend to say. In fact, I do not know. Something, however, must have gone wrong. For he certainly sallied forth, and after no great interval, with an air of quite desolate and chapfallen. It was the very witching hour of the night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted, pursued his travels homewards. In the dead hush of midnight, no signs of life occurred near him, and all the stories of ghosts and goblins that he'd heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. He'd never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the centre of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered over all the other trees of the neighbourhood. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees. They twisted down almost to the earth, and then rising again into the air. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, from the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought he heard his whistle answered. It was but a blast sweeping through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, perceived it to be but a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against his saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough against the other as they were blown about in the breeze. Ichabod passed this tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen. A few rough logs laid side by side served as a bridge over this stream. Now this has ever been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who must cross it alone after dark. As Ichabod approached this stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across. Gunpowder dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, and with a suddenness that nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at that moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the road caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, he beheld something huge, misshapen, and towering. It stirred not, yet seemed gathered up in the gloom like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveller. The hair on the affrighted pedagogue rose on his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly now was too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, who could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded, in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. "Who are you?" Still, there was no answer. Once more he cudgelled the sides of the inflexible gunpowder, but just then the shadowy object of alarm set itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. It appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up, fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveller in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck upon perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have been on his shoulders, was instead rested on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows on old Gunpowder, hoping with sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed, through thick and thin, stones flying, sparks flashing at every bound. Now, as yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskilful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he got halfway through the hollow, the girth of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping away from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavoured to hold it firm, but in vain, and he just had time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. Now, an opening in the trees cheered Ichabod with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. He recollected the place where Brom Bones, his ghostly competitor, had disappeared. "Oh, if I can just reach that bridge," he thought, "I am safe." Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang up on the bridge. He thundered across the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side. And now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. But just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavoured to dodge the horrible missile, but too late it encounters his cranium with a tremendous crash, and he was tumbled headlong into the dirt, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found, without his saddle, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make an appearance at breakfast that morning. Dinner hour came, and still no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse. There was no schoolmaster. In one part of the road leading to the church was found a saddle, trampled in the dirt. The tracks of horses' hooves, deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed, were traced back to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, of course, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be found. This mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. The stories of Brower, of Bones, of a whole budget of others were called to mind. When they had all diligently considered them all, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. Now, it's true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was alive, that he had left the neighborhood, partly through fear of the goblin, and partly in mortification at having been so suddenly dismissed by the heiress. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted successfully the blooming Katrina to the altar, he was observed to look exceedingly knowingly whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and he always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect he knew more about the matter than he cared to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges in these matters, they maintain to this day that Ichabod Crane was spirited away by supernatural means. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay, and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue. And the ploughboy, loitering homeward on a still summer's evening, has often fancied hearing his voice in the distance, chanting among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow.